January 27th, 1945, 0620 hours, Stalag IX-A, Ziegenhain, Germany. A 25-year-old master sergeant stood in snow that reached his ankles, the cold so deep it burned the lungs, and watched 1,200 men line up behind him in formation. The German commandant had ordered only the Jews to assemble. Instead, every American prisoner of war in the camp now stood outside their barracks, breath rising like ghosts in the pre-dawn dark, waiting to see if their senior non-commissioned officer had just signed their death warrant. Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds had defied a direct order from the enemy. In 90 seconds, a Luger would press against his forehead, and he would be given one final chance to step back, to comply, to save himself. He would refuse, and that refusal would become the difference between life and death for 200 men who would never know his name. The 422nd Infantry Regiment had entered combat on December 10, 1944, in the Schnee-Eifel, a forested ridge along the German-Belgian border where the trees grew so thick that even daylight felt like dusk. They were green troops, fresh from the States, part of the 106th Infantry Division that had been rushed to a quiet sector to gain experience. The quiet lasted 6 days. On December 16th, at 0530 hours, German artillery tore through the morning fog in waves so dense the ground itself seemed to scream. This was the opening salvo of the Ardennes offensive, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge, and 2 regiments of the 106th Division found themselves at the center of the largest German counterattack on the Western Front. For 3 days, the men of the 422nd fought without sleep, without food, without resupply. Ammunition dwindled to handfuls, morphine ran out. Wounded men lay in frozen foxholes because there was no way to evacuate them and no medics left to treat them. By December 18th, the regiment was encircled, cut off from division headquarters, surrounded by panzer units and Volksgrenadier divisions that had punched through American lines with terrifying speed. Orders came by radio: attack toward Schönberg, break through, link up with friendly forces. The 422nd tried. They were shattered within hours. On December 19th, 1944, Colonel Georges Deschenaux made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He surrendered what remained of his regiment to prevent total annihilation. Over 7,000 American soldiers became prisoners of war that day, one of the largest mass surrenders in U.S. Army history. Among them was a soft-spoken tobacco farmer from Tennessee named Roddie Edmonds, who had enlisted because it was the right thing to do, who had risen to master sergeant because men trusted him, and who now faced a new kind of war where the enemy did not wear a uniform but spoke in bureaucratic orders and genocidal policy. The Germans forced the captured Americans to march 50 kilometers through frozen roads to Gerolstein, then loaded them into boxcars with no food, no water, no space to sit. 4 days in the dark, the cold seeping through wooden slats, men collapsing from dysentery and frostbite and despair. When the doors finally opened at Bad Orb, Germany, the prisoners stumbled out into a camp designed for half their number, where starvation rations were distributed once a day and lice infested every bunk, and the guards looked at them not as soldiers, but as refuse. Edmonds watched his men deteriorate, watched their eyes hollow out, watched the strongest among them begin to fade because the human body can endure cold or hunger, but not both, not for weeks without end. After a month at Bad Orb, the Germans divided the prisoners into 3 groups: officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men. Edmonds, as the highest-ranking NCO among the Americans, was placed in charge of 1,275 men and transferred to Stalag IX-A near Ziegenhain. They marched again, this time through snow so deep it swallowed their boots with every step, their feet cracked and blistered, still wearing the same uniforms in which they had been captured a month before. January 1945 was one of the coldest winters of the 20th century in Europe, with temperatures plunging to negative 25 degrees Celsius and blizzards that turned the landscape into a white void. Men fell during the march and did not get up. The guards kept moving. At Stalag IX-A, Edmonds took stock of his responsibility. Over 1,000 American soldiers, malnourished and freezing, dependent on him for leadership in a place where leadership meant navigating the arbitrary cruelty of captors who followed orders that treated human beings as categories to be sorted and disposed of. He had seen what happened at Bad Orb. The Germans had separated the Jewish prisoners there, segregating them into special barracks, marking them. 350 men identified as Jews or suspected of being Jewish were shipped to Berga, an underground slave labor camp where they would be worked to death manufacturing munitions in tunnels carved beneath the earth. Edmonds understood the pattern. This was not military detention. This was extermination by bureaucracy, the machinery of genocide operating within the structure of prisoner-of-war camps, a violation of every principle outlined in the Geneva Conventions that both nations had signed. When Commandant Siegmann issued the order on the evening of January 26th, Edmonds knew exactly what it meant. All Jewish prisoners were to report the following morning for separate assembly. The announcement was delivered in German, then translated by a camp interpreter, the words hanging in the frozen air of the barracks like a death sentence. 200 Jewish soldiers among the 1,275 Americans understood immediately. They were being singled out not for interrogation or work detail, but for removal to a place from which few returned. Fear moved through the camp in whispers, in glances exchanged between men who had fought together and been captured together, and who now faced separation based on a word, a designation, a line drawn by an ideology that measured human worth in blood and ancestry. Roddie Edmonds spent that night awake, sitting on the edge of his bunk in the freezing dark, thinking through what came next. He could comply. He could order the Jewish soldiers to fall out in the morning, follow the German directive, preserve his own safety and that of the non-Jewish majority. The logic was coldly pragmatic. If he resisted, the Germans might retaliate against everyone. If he complied, at least most of the men would survive. But Edmonds had been raised in a Tennessee household where Sunday school was not a ritual, but a foundation, where the teachings of Scripture were measured not in what you said, but in what you did when the cost was highest. He thought about the men under his command, soldiers who had trusted him with their lives in combat and now trusted him with their dignity in captivity. He thought about the Geneva Conventions, the international agreements that were supposed to protect prisoners of war, that explicitly stated a soldier was required to give only name, rank, and serial number, not religion, not ethnicity, not the details that a genocidal regime could use to sort the living from the condemned. And he made a decision that should have been impossible. That night, he moved through the barracks, quietly informing every American prisoner, "Tomorrow, everyone falls out. Not just the Jews, not just a brave few." All 1,275 men would stand together in formation when the Germans came for the roll call. Some of the soldiers argued. This was madness. This would get them all killed. Edmonds did not raise his voice. He simply repeated the order, and something in his tone, the certainty, the absence of doubt, made clear that this was not up for debate. He was their senior non-commissioned officer. He was responsible for them, and he would not hand over a single man to be murdered because of his faith. Dawn came cold and pale, the sky the color of old steel, the ground frozen so hard it rang beneath their boots. At 0620 hours, 1,275 American prisoners of war stood in formation outside their barracks, lined up in ranks as if for inspection, their breath visible in the sub-zero air. Commandant Siegmann emerged from the administrative building, flanked by guards, expecting to see a small group of frightened Jewish soldiers separated from the rest. Instead, he saw the entire camp population assembled before him, row after row of men standing at attention in the snow, silent and unmoving, a wall of defiance without a single word spoken. Siegmund's face went rigid with fury. He strode directly toward Master Sergeant Edmonds, who stood at the front of the formation, and began shouting in German, the words sharp and guttural, demanding to know why all the prisoners had fallen out when only the Jews had been ordered to report. Edmonds met his eyes and replied in English, calm and steady, his voice carrying across the frozen assembly ground. "We are all Jews here." The words hung in the air, impossible and absolute, a statement that rewrote the boundaries of identity and solidarity in a single sentence. Siegmund stopped mid-stride. His hand moved to his holster. He drew his Luger, the metallic click of the safety releasing audible in the silence, and stepped forward until the barrel of the pistol pressed directly against Roddie Edmonds's forehead, right between the eyes. The German commandant's voice was a scream now, raw and uncontrolled, ordering Edmonds to identify the Jewish soldiers immediately or be shot on the spot. 1,200 men held their breath. No one moved. No one broke formation. Edmonds did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, the cold steel of the Luger pressed into his skin, and spoke again, his tone measured and deliberate, as if he were explaining a simple fact to someone who had momentarily forgotten the rules. He cited the Geneva Convention, article and principle, stating that a prisoner of war was required to provide only name, rank, and serial number, not religion, not ethnicity. He informed Siegmann that if he shot an American non-commissioned officer for refusing an illegal order, he would be tried as a war criminal when the war ended. The threat was not bluster. It was calculation. Germany was losing. The Reich, that had promised 1,000 years, was collapsing in real time, the Eastern Front crumbling under Soviet advances, the Western Allies pushing deeper into occupied territory with every passing week. Siegmann knew this. Every officer in the Wehrmacht knew this. And the specter of post-war justice, of tribunals and prosecutions and the records that documented every atrocity, was beginning to haunt those who had carried out orders without question. For 30 seconds, the commandant stood frozen, the pistol trembling against Edmonds's forehead, his finger on the trigger. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon. He holstered the Luger, turned without a word, and walked back toward the administrative building, his guards following in stunned silence. The assembly was dismissed. 1,275 men returned to their barracks, and not a single Jewish soldier was separated that day. 200 lives had been saved by a refusal to comply, by a master sergeant from Tennessee who understood that leadership was not about following orders, but about knowing when to disobey them. If you made it this far, you're the reason channels like ours can keep the past alive. Let me know where you're tuning in from, drop a like, and subscribe so these voices from history continue to be heard. What Roddie Edmonds prevented became clear only after liberation. At Stalag IX-B, the camp where the Americans had first been held, the Germans had successfully identified 350 Jewish prisoners and transported them to Berge an der Elster, a subcamp of Buchenwald. There, they were forced into underground tunnels to manufacture synthetic fuel and munitions, working 16-hour shifts in darkness and cold, subsisting on starvation rations that reduced grown men to skeletal figures barely capable of standing. Many did not survive. Those who did emerged from Berge as living ghosts, their bodies broken, their minds scarred by the knowledge that they had been marked for slow death simply because of their ancestry. The 200 Jewish soldiers at Stalag IX-A avoided this fate because one man stood between them and the machinery of extermination, because one master sergeant refused to turn back when turning back was the expected, the rational, the self-preserving choice. Paul Stern, a Jewish corporal who had been transferred to Stalag IX-A after earning a battlefield promotion, later recounted the moment with a clarity that never faded. He remembered the fear that had gripped the Jewish prisoners the night before the assembly, the certainty that they were about to be shipped to their deaths, the quiet desperation of men writing final letters they knew would never be sent. He remembered the shock of seeing the entire camp fall out in formation, the realization that Edmonds had put every American life on the line to protect them. And he remembered the silence after Siegmann walked away, the way no one spoke for minutes afterward because there were no words sufficient to describe what had just occurred. Years later, when Yad Vashem began investigating Edmonds's actions for recognition as righteous among the nations, Stern testified that they had all understood the stakes. The Germans were murdering Jews, and the order to separate them meant imminent danger. Edmonds, he said, had defied the Germans at the risk of immediate death, with the unexpected consequence that the Jewish prisoners were saved. But the story did not end with liberation in April 1945, when American forces overran the camp and freed the prisoners. Roddie Edmonds returned home to Tennessee, resumed his life, married, raised children, worked as a factory equipment salesman, attended church, participated in community events. He never spoke about what happened at Stalag IX-A. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to fellow veterans who gathered to share war stories at American Legion halls. The moment that defined his courage, that saved 200 men from almost certain death, remained locked in silence for 40 years. Why? Perhaps because for Edmonds it was not a moment of heroism, but a moment of basic decency, the minimum action required of a leader responsible for the men under his command. Perhaps because speaking about it would have meant reliving the fear, the weight of the Luger against his forehead, the knowledge that 1,200 men stood ready to die with him if Siegmann had pulled the trigger. Or perhaps because in the post-war world, where America was sorting through the trauma and mythology of victory, there was little space for stories that complicated the narrative, that revealed the Holocaust not as a distant atrocity, but as a machinery that reached into POW camps and demanded complicity from soldiers who were supposed to be protected by international law. Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds died on August 8, 1985, at the age of 65, his actions at Stalag IX-A still unknown to the world. It was not until 2015, 30 years after his death, that his son, Chris Edmonds, discovered the truth while researching his father's military service. A chance encounter with a Jewish chaplain led to contact with survivors, testimony, corroboration from multiple witnesses who had been there that frozen morning in January 1945. In 2016, Yad Vashem posthumously recognized Roddie Edmonds as righteous among the nations, one of only 5 Americans to receive the honor, a designation reserved for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. In 2024, the United States Congress introduced legislation to award Edmonds the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor, for his extraordinary act of courage and moral leadership. But the deeper meaning of Stalag IX-A lies not in the awards or recognition, but in the question that Edmonds's refusal forces us to confront. What is the limit of obedience when obedience becomes complicity in atrocity? Military discipline is built on the principle of following orders, on the hierarchical structure that allows units to function under the chaos of combat. Yet history has repeatedly demonstrated that the most profound acts of moral courage occur when individuals recognize that certain orders must be defied, that there are lines which, once crossed, dissolve the legitimacy of authority. Edmonds understood this in a way that transcended doctrine. He did not invoke abstract principles or philosophical arguments. He simply stood in the snow with a pistol to his head and stated the truth. "We are all Jews here." That sentence was not a metaphor. It was a declaration of shared humanity, a refusal to allow arbitrary categories of identity to determine who lives and who dies, a recognition that solidarity in the face of genocidal logic is not optional, but essential. The 200 Jewish soldiers at Stalag IX-A survived because one man refused to turn back, refused to comply, refused to accept that following orders was more important than protecting lives. They survived because leadership in its truest form is not about authority, but about responsibility. The willingness to stand between those under your care and the forces that would destroy them, even when standing means risking everything. Edmonds had no guarantee that Siegmann would back down. He had no certainty that the Geneva Convention argument would carry weight with a commandant operating under Nazi ideology. He had only the conviction that handing over Jewish soldiers to be murdered was a line he would not cross, and the courage to stake his life on that conviction. The fact that he never spoke of it, that he returned to an ordinary life and carried the memory in silence, reveals something profound about the nature of true heroism. It is not performed for recognition or reward, but enacted because in the moment when choice crystallizes into action, there is no alternative that allows you to remain who you are. January 27th, 1945, in the frozen pre-dawn darkness of a prisoner of war camp in central Germany, 1,275 men stood together and declared that they would not participate in their own division, that they would not allow hatred to categorize them into the saved and the condemned. History records few such moments with clarity. Most acts of resistance are fragmented, ambiguous, lost in the noise of larger events. But Stalag IX-A endures because it was witnessed, because survivors testified, because the impossible courage of one master sergeant became a reminder that even in systems designed to dehumanize, individuals retain the power to refuse, to resist, to stand in defiance of orders that would turn them into instruments of genocide. Roddie Edmonds should have turned back. Every instinct of self-preservation, every calculation of risk, every voice of caution would have told him to comply, to save himself, to accept that he could not change what was coming. He did not turn back, and because he did not, 200 men lived to see liberation, to return home, to build families and futures that would have been erased if one soldier from Tennessee had valued his own survival over the principle that no man under his command would be abandoned to murder. That is the lesson of Stalag IX-A. Not that heroism is easy or that moral courage is common, but that in the most extreme circumstances, when the machinery of atrocity demands complicity, the refusal of a single individual can become the difference between life and death for hundreds. We are all Jews here. 4 words spoken into the barrel of a pistol that saved 200 men and echoed across 80 years to remind us that solidarity is not abstract, that leadership is measured in the willingness to stand when standing means risking everything, and that the greatest victories of the Second World War were not always won on battlefields, but in frozen prison camps where one man refused to turn back and, in that refusal, preserved not just lives, but the very possibility of human decency in the face of absolute evil.